there, Banditos. Welcome to the latest episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today we have a graphic novelist, a cartoonist. His name is Craig Thompson. You know Craig most likely from his magnum opus, one of the most critically acclaimed, best-selling graphic novels of all time, Blankets. But he's also done Goodbye, Chunky Rice, Habibi. And now he has a brand new graphic memoir slash historical tome about ginseng and his relationship and his childhood relationship with ginseng called Ginseng Roots. And I got to see an advanced version of this. It's really a stunning work. It came out in installments in sort of floppy, traditional comics over, 12 months, or rather over 12 issues. And it's really stunning. I want you guys to all give this work a chance and go out, get a copy. It's really a great book. So, without further ado, this is Craig Thompson. Craig, how are you doing?
Great. Good to see you, Michael. Thank you.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming on. So you have a new book out called Ginseng Roots, which we will get into heavily later, but it also kind of answers what is usually our first question to guess, which is how did you discover comics? So it's answered in the book, but since many have maybe not picked up the book quite yet, it's pretty new. Please answer that for our audience.
Okay. Well, my love and interest in comics coincided with my first job when I was 10 years old, which was working in ginseng agriculture. Um, so there's a lot to explain after that. But yeah, the first comic, though, that I ever found was just I was at like a Christian summer camp, and our parents gave my sister and brother and I $1 to get something from the gift shop. Actually, revision, not a Christian summer camp. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had these comics. It was Yogi Bear camps.
Okay.
Do you know these camps?
No, actually, I
Pop
don't, but I
Popular
like
in
the
the
name.
Midwest. And it was, yes, the Hanna-Barbera Yogi Bear. And they were just like you pitch a tent, sort of family camps. And yeah, in the gift shop, we were given $1. And I think our sister got candy. There was the temptation to get like a rubber tomahawk or something like that. You could tell it was the 80s when you could have those kind of items. But my brother and I each got a comic book from the spinner rack. And they were like Star Comics, those Marvel licensed Saturday morning cartoon properties.
Right, right.
Ewoks, in fact.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and then that exact same summer is when I started working in ginseng with my mother. And this was a 40-hour a week job. Um, the summer before, it was like we'd have to join our mother as she went to like summer jobs and just kind of sit around and be bored. And this was a summer, it's like, oh, the farmer offered us a wage of $1 an hour to work alongside our mother, weeding ginseng gardens. And $1 in our young minds translated exactly to one comic book an hour. So it was like perfect timing to fuel a brand new interest, which I couldn't have indulged otherwise. I mean, we were like a working class family. I always say that my parents provided what we needed, but not what we wanted. There was none of that expendable income for indulgent things like comic books. So I wouldn't have had comics in my life other than, the Sunday newspaper, which was really my first love. But comic books as a format all started with ginseng work. So yes, I was jumping all over the place, but the new book is about that first job, and then it's also broadly about this magical medicinal Chinese herb, ginseng.
Yes. Um, as I said, we will get into all of that. I'm very excited to talk about it. Um, I wanted to ask, based on that answer and also based on what's in Ginseng Roots, you basically draw some of what you're describing into the book. And you even show some of kind of the diversity of comics that you and your brother picked up. And it looks like as I said, it's sort of a healthy diversity of different kinds of books, including my mind went to some of the, 80s and 90s like superhero stuff that it seemed like you were reading alongside all of us as well that were, around this age. Um, did you ever, from that primary influence, ever think about going into that creative direction, sort of the
Oh yeah.
mainstream, I guess, superhero stuff, or was it always going to be um, kind of your own stories that are being told?
No, I definitely went through my superhero phase. Our obsession began with the spinner rack at the local pharmacy and whatever was the most, accessible mainstream stuff. So Marvel and DC. For some reason, I remember that spinner rack, but it was also maybe that era in the 80s being very Marvel centric. And so that was kind of how we were primed. And I mentioned these Star Comics. It was this kid's imprint. That was our gateway. And those were things like Ewoks and droids and Heathcliff and Elf, very much marketed towards little kids and like that Saturday morning fare. But then we quickly graduated to, superheroes and
Hmm.
primarily X titles. I mean, that was our obsession. So this is like New Mutants when it's Louise Simonson and Brett Blevins, X Factor with Walter Simonson, and then the Chris Claremont and Mark Silvestri era of X-Men. And those three titles were like our biggest loves in the superhero realm. And that lasted a couple of years. And yeah, I read how to draw comics the Marvel way. I really wanted to, to be a comic book penciler. I love that I had chosen pencils over inks too. And didn't even really consider writing. It was just like, I want to be a comic book penciler. Um, but after we like used up our options at the spinner rack, and there was no local comic shop in rural Wisconsin, we were ordering our comics online from those little ads in the back of the comics. And we were using New England Comics, which is in Massachusetts, which became famous for Ben Edlund's The Tick. Uh, but it was the era of the 1980s independent explosion, and we would just like go to town ordering anything, that was black and white, Turtles and all the spin-offs, Usagi Yojimbo, and I don't consider it a spin-off, but I mean like these were our early loves. And I think it was like independent black and white comics that we really, really got obsessed with comics.
And so that turned your mind when you were starting to think about this professionally towards um, whether it's fantasy or not, the sort of black and white DIY sort of aesthetic in terms of where you wanted to take your career. Is that right?
Yeah, and as far as the Turtles went, that was the biggest example of success in comics at that moment. So,
Hmm.
and it was what excited us more. It's like these creator-owned properties, like coming up, inventing your whole new world, and yeah, and black and white aesthetically imprinted on me very early on at a young age. I preferred it over color. That was a different era of color though, too. It was more limited palette, but
Hmm.
yeah, black and white became our true love. Now that I say that out loud, it's probably informed by the newspaper strip being my first love of the comics format. So it was Peanuts, Charlie Brown, later Bloom County, and then later Calvin and Hobbes. All of those kind of predated comic books for me too. So it was like the daily black and white newspaper strip was really maybe what primed me for black and white.
And so you moved from, your, I was going to say your hometown, I guess your hometown, your home state to Portland eventually. And I think did a little work at Dark Horse, which I think any cartoonist at in Portland probably does. And then you came out with your first graphic novel, which was Goodbye Chunky Rice. I'm curious whether that was you had sort of a lot of ideas at that point for what you wanted to do? And if so, how did you choose Goodbye Chunky Rice out of those ideas? Or was it just sort of, you're like, well, I want to do something now, and almost improvisationally came up with that?
Great question. I think the answer is all of the above. Um, yeah, I moved to Portland at age 21 in 1997, worked at Dark Horse for just under a year as a graphic designer. That was my last real job um, before I started like the freelance lifestyle. And when I left Wisconsin and moved to Portland, I was making mini comics all the time and printing those at Kinko's and trading them at shows. And I was working on a bunch of projects, but one was this mini comic called Goodbye Chunky Rice, which really was mostly just short stories about my friends in Wisconsin, little autobiographical, 3 to 5 pagers that were interspersed with little 1 to 2 pagers of this little cute cartoon turtle on his little journey. And when I moved to Portland, I met Brett Warnock, who at the time was a bartender, who was doing a little self-publishing operation in his basement called Primal Groove Press. And his main publication was called Top Shelf. It was an anthology. But uh, Brett was wanting to step out and start doing like kind of self-contained books. And he saw what he was working on. He said like, "Oh, these autobiographical stories you're doing, they're a little too personal, for the reader. But I love this little cartoon turtle. If you flesh that out into a full-length book, I would publish it." And at the time, I already had in my sketchbooks the kernel of the idea for blankets, but I don't think I was like ready to make that kind of book. And I had this prompt of Brett saying like, "I want the little turtle guy." So that ended up being my first book, and it was really like the way to channel everything I felt emotionally about leaving my friends and leaving Wisconsin. That displacement into this funny animal comic, so to speak.
It's interesting to hear that you had some other things that were going on in those mini comics that were autobiographical because going from Goodbye Chunky Rice to Blankets, which really blew up, I thought that was sort of a fundamental shift from, cute animal character adventure, I guess you would call it, to, very deep and personal autobiographical. So it seems like you already had that percolating though, and you were doing that type of work before, um, you know, Goodbye Chunky Rice.
Yeah, but I think Brett Warnock was right. Those weren't very good strips. They were very much like created as like individual love letters to my friends, So they were sort of like had that sort of inside joke quality. It was about our connections, but it wasn't like something you would necessarily share with a broader readership. And also I didn't really know how to draw realistically or draw the human form. That took some time for me to develop. Like I was more influenced by, like I said, like Charles Schultz and Bill Watterson, and then maybe some Dr. Seuss. Like I really just had a cartoony style. Um, I liked drawing cute animals, and I think learning how to draw like the human form that sort of was inspired by like the new wave of French cartoonists or European cartoonists that I was looking at, and the sort of expressive and realistic way they were working and drawing.
So let's talk a little bit about Blankets. I'm sure you've probably talked out about it, but um, there, what first of all, it's mentioned in Ginseng Roots. And I do want to get back to that where there's a lot of sort of metatextual things going on in Ginseng Roots where you're looking back on previous works and so on and so forth, as well as sort of almost thinking about the book while writing it. So that's a little theme to come back to. But um, this was a huge work, both in terms of ambition and execution, just number of pages, sheer number of pages of art and things to think about. How do you plan a book like that out? And your subsequent works also have been quite long and deep. It just seems to me when I'm thinking about it, at least at the outset, that it's a huge mountain to climb, even though it's something you want to get out as an artist. What kind of planning goes into such large volumes?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I started working on this book initially in 2011. So quite a long time ago. A month after Habibi went to press, I went to China for my first research trip, thinking like, oh, this is what I'm going to start on next. Um, and I forget how long. I wasn't that long in China, maybe 2 weeks. And but I don't think I don't know. I didn't have. I did feel intimidated by the time that blankets. Or, I'm sorry. By the time Habibi saw publication, I felt really exhausted and not prepared to do another research-driven book, you know? And that hence I did Space Dumplings, which is much more playful and light and fun, something to just kind of reconnect with the kid in myself, because I wasn't ready for the research. And then, 4 years go by, the time it takes to do Dumplings. After Space Dumplings, I start working on a number of different projects that aren't getting real traction for me. Like I was working on a sequel to Space Dumplings. I was working on this collaboration with this French cartoonist, Edmond Baudouin. I was working on um, this, I would say, erotic book, like these three projects, and nothing was really, getting steam or sticking. And that's when I rediscovered the ginseng book in my sketchbooks, of like, oh, this book. And it was a perfect time in my life to kind of go back to where I came from, literally, to go back to rural Wisconsin and reconcile some things there. And I started the book first with my own memories of these experiences. Then I started comparing notes with my family members and really having those memories expanded upon. And then I went on a short trip back home to interview the first farmers I worked with as a kid. Um, Most of them are retired now, but that was like the first research trip. Go and interview my family, go and interview this first wave of farmers. And I guess because it was kind of on a small level and like a personal level, that was the right place to start this project that I knew was going to grow and grow and expand with research.
Well, it's
Did that
funny that you
answer?
mentioned, yeah, no, you did. It's funny that you mentioned that you weren't feeling ready to do research, and then you rediscovered this kernel of an idea, which I think starts with more memory. So there's, sort of a lighter maybe form of research there, but then you want to marry it with what seems to me to be quite a lot of research into not only what is happening or what has happened in Wisconsin, but then what's happening in Korea and China as well, or their ginseng, the value of ginseng and their trade and all of that kind of stuff. So were you like on nuts? I have to do research again, or were
No,
you
I
really
like
once you rediscovered that you were like, okay, I'm back in and I can do this?
yeah, I like the research. I mean, it starts, like I said, with memories, and I was reading books. But then when you're reading books, you're like, oh, I want a more tangible experience of these things. Um, and so I went back to Asia. I went to, like you mentioned, to South Korea and Northeast China. And then perfectly, my hometown orchestrated its first international ginseng festival.
Right.
But that happened a year later after I'd started the project. Things kind of get moved around a bit in the timeline of the book. Um, I actually went to Korea and China before the first ginseng festival in my hometown, and those kind of get flipped in the book. But at a certain point, when you're also laying out these personal scenes, you're like, well, narratively, it makes more sense if that timeline moves. But yeah, research is fun. For me, it's almost like a form of procrastination. I'd rather research. But then the days go by, the months go that by. Suddenly it's like 2 years that I've been just reading. And I'm like, oh, maybe it's time to sit down and actually make something new, you know? Um, and so, yeah, suddenly I realized that I've just been losing years doing research, an elaborate form of procrastination, and it's time to draw. But it took me a while to get there. It wasn't until fall of 2018 that I was like stabilized in a place and I just thought, I'm just gonna start drawing.
Is that the next step? Is it go research right to drawing? Do you find the story within the drawing, or are you also do you come up with an elaborate or even a simple outline of where you're going to go in the sequence of events?
Yes. Exactly. There's an outline. Yeah. And I totally jumped over a real major point, which was that this book was serialized as
Right.
pamphlet comic books first. So um, the choice of 12 issues was arbitrary. That's just like the what I imposed on myself of like, okay, I want to do a traditional 12 issue series. And then I came up with an outline structure within those issues. Like, this is what this issue is going to be about. This is what this issue is going to be about. And it was fairly consistent with that, actually. But then as I was working on the issues, I really only focused on one at a time. Usually if I'm writing Blankets or Habibi, I write a draft from beginning to end, and then I revise and edit that many times before I start drawing final art. But this one, I was only worrying about each chapter, each issue at a time before I'd move on to the next. But there was an outline, and it was fairly faithful to the outline. The final book is different from the series. So, by the time I'd finished the series, 12 issues, I sat down and read them all, and it didn't feel complete. It followed the outline I had planned. Each issue felt really self-contained and solid in its own way, but their cohesiveness wasn't there. So I kind of despaired for a while, like, wait, this isn't working. This is not a book. This is a series, but it's not a book. How do I make it a book? And so one, I had to shatter the container and kind of move chapters around into a new order. But I also added a lot more material, at least 60 or 70 new story pages with some pretty major themes. And the biggest of those was my personal health crisis. I was having all these problems with my drawing hands from the very inception of the project, but then that just exacerbated the whole way. And so I realized including that journey was really what the glue that the whole book needed. And it allowed me to use a lot of the interviews I had done with this Chinese medicine practitioner because, surprisingly and organically, this person I had interviewed early in the series later on became my doctor. And early on, I joked with him, like, oh, maybe you'll prescribe ginseng for me. And organically, he did. Finally, he was like, yeah, this is actually the herb you need to nourish your hands.
How are your hands now? This was a question I had because it's sort of a repeating. I don't know if a motif is the right word, but you come back to it, how your hand was feeling, and then the treatment of it.
Yeah, they're not good. I have many different conditions, mostly genetic. Um, and I haven't really found anything that works. My main hand doctor had prescribed radiation, and I did that a couple of years ago. But the irradiation seems to have made everything worse. Like, it just was like it mutated the existing process and deformity in my hands and made it way, way worse. That might just be randomly age and time, but it seemed like the radiation made it worse. And then I got hand surgery on my left hand. It's my non-dominant hand, but I thought I'd sacrifice that one first. And that did not go well. That's had about a year to recover, and it's not responded well to surgery. So I'm very hesitant to do my drawing hand the same. So it's not great, you know. I wish I had a more optimistic. Like, it'd be great if I emerged at the end of this journey being like, yes, I found the thing that fixed me.
Right.
But I have yet to find that.
Did you find that you had to change anything you had planned within the art of the series based on, these conditions? Or were you really, um, adamant about
Yeah, I
drawing
mean,
through the pain
ironic.
and making sure what's on this page is exactly what you want?
The latter, the latter.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had hand pain since I was a little kid, so I've always kind of pushed through the pain. It's always been a part of my process. And ironically, this book is probably more dense and detailed than any other book I've done. I think, like, with Habibi, that set a bar high of like really tons of ornamentation and detail. But I've sort of continued to some degree with Space Dumplings and Ginseng Roots, layering tons of detail on my pages. But one thing I will say about the hands is like it's not necessarily like drawing is the most difficult task with my condition. Other things are more difficult, like strength and, like those kind of things are more compromised than delicate operations like drawing.
Hmm.
But for my own safety, I do have to find ways to work that are a little looser and less strenuous.
Yeah.
That'll be the next project. If I continue drawing, it's going to be in a way that's more gentle on my body. But I think all artists have to figure that out.
Sure, sure, absolutely. I wanted to ask you a couple questions about format. One, you brought up already that this was serialized into, pamphlet comics. Um, why did you make that choice? And did that present any kind of challenges that you had not run into in previous, long form works?
Yeah. I made that choice. The first reason for making that choice was I wanted something out sooner than later. I didn't want to labor in my cave for near a decade before I had something new out. I wanted to have it out there sooner, and I wanted what I hoped would be constructive feedback from readers that might influence the direction of the book, especially this project because it was, you know, research and interview driven. Um, if I were to get some piece of information wrong, it'd be really useful if somebody told me that in real time, where I could correct it before it was a final graphic novel. Likewise, if there was an interview subject that might, or like subject or interviewee that might come up of like, oh, I'm someone you should talk to about this. So I was kind of hoping for that. I wanted it to have a sort of malleable quality while I was working on the book. And I've witnessed that in other cartoonists. They're like, oh, we're getting reader feedback, and that influences the direction the story takes. And that seemed intriguing to me. In the end, though, I think it just added a lot more time to the process. It slowed things down. Um, but also just this project in general, like the fact that it is all interview based, I don't get to make up the dialogue. I have to work from the raw materials. That slows it down. When you're doing a series, you have to do, the covers and book design and production and troubleshoot all that, whatever the catalog copy. So there's all these extra things that are distracting you from just plowing ahead and finishing the story. So it really complicated my process. But I was happy to do it for once in my career. I've never done worked in that format unless you count those photocopied mini comics,
Hmm.
zines. But I never had a professionally published pamphlet comic book. Um, and I was at the time I was very bored with graphic novels, and I still have a little bit of that boredom with graphic novels. And it's not. It's just that there's so many of them, and and they're so expensive. And how do you dip in and sample comics the way we used to? It's hard to. The comics don't seem as accessible as they were, say, in the 90s, where you could go into a shop with 20 bucks and pick up a bunch of books to explore different creators. Now that would get you one graphic novel that you're either going to like or not. So, um, yeah, I wanted to do comic books. I missed that era of the 80s and 90s when people were still doing indie comics.
I was wondering if there was some of that in your motivation, just making comic books, which is it's a different form than graphic
For sure.
novels. I mean, I think a lot of the first graphic novels, well, the term was maybe misapplied to, trade paperbacks, like collections of stories. But yeah, I mean, there is something to that original format that you and I and a lot of people have sort of fallen in love with. Just getting those comics and having some more of a serialized nature to it, something to look forward to.
Yeah, I tried
But
to end, each chapter, keep them as self-contained as possible. I didn't take advantage of the cliffhanger format. But also the best I was doing was 4 issues a year, and then maybe the worst year there was only one issue out. So the cliffhanger formats can be really annoying with indie comics that don't have a frequent publication schedule.
right.
Um, but yeah, I got to indulge in things like the old school letters page. which was something I always loved. It's pretty irrelevant now that all communication is digital.
Right.
But it was amazing to have a letters page because it gave the readers this chance to share their stories. That really did expand the story that was happening already in the pages. And then people were writing about real time, like news, but on a personal level. So all this upheaval was happening. The pandemic being the big one, you know.
Yeah.
But everything, George Floyd's murder and like the January 6th, attack on the Capitol. All these things are happening in real time, and people are writing about it in their personal connections. They're writing about their own like search for belonging in the world, their childhood jobs, but also their current jobs. People during pandemic were going through that evaluation process of examining what they do and its meaning if they wanted to continue to do that. So there was like a really juicy letters page in the back of Ginseng Roots.
I would almost love to have that letters page right now because it
Hmm.
seems interesting. That and you may have wanted to avoid this in some way because we God forbid we have enough politics in our life right now, but the fact that China is such at the forefront of news right now and trade and agricultural trade and things of that nature, it seems like there's some, I don't know, overlap or element that gets to, the story you were trying to tell with not the personal story necessarily, but the sort of the overarching kind of ginseng cross-cultural, like there's the Wisconsin ginseng, there's the Chinese ginseng, and how it all gets affected by tariffs and trade and things like that. I thought that would be, you would have some interesting letters, I wonder, around this
Yeah,
time if you were still going with it.
you're exactly right. And you're reminding me that I've been meaning to reach out to Will Sue. He is one of the people I interviewed. He's in chapter 5 of the book and chapter or issue 9 of the series. His family is Taiwanese American. His dad was an immigrant from Taiwan, and they grew into one of the biggest mega growers of ginseng in my region. But they also have a lot of ties with like politics. They had ties to the Bush administration and the first Trump administration with Terry Gou, who's the Foxconn CEO from
Right.
Taiwan. And I'm really curious about Will Sue's knowledge and attitude about the tariffs right now. I want to know how it's affecting the ginseng industry and them directly, but he would understand all of this much better than me. I mean, he's every day dealing with trade in China. Um, and so, yes, I'm meaning to reach out with them to see if there's some opportunity to do like maybe a short story, like a follow-up chapter, you know?
Epilogue, maybe.
Yeah, an epilogue. Yeah, for the next edition or something that we could publish in some other forum. It might be fun to do even an extra issue with uncivilized books,
Hmm.
so that when the book is coming out, it comes out April 29th, there might be this cool little supplemental comic book to also remind people that it was a series at one point.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea. Another formatting question is that I noticed, as I'm sure anybody would, that this is not a fully black and white book. You have, I don't know what you would call it, spot coloring. I wonder, first of all, is it's a red. Um, are all of the other colors just gradients of one red?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's only
And
two colors. It's a black and a red ink, a
okay.
Pantone.
And
And
so when you see the orange or the lighter, that's just a lighter version of that same color.
yes. So I got pretty obsessive about it. I mean, I could have kept that minimal, and just done a very 100% spot color that doesn't, but instead I'm too obsessive. And I was kind of nerding out on overprint technique and how if you have like 30% of one color overprinting on 30% of another color, you get all this whole range of sepia tones. And the red color worked really well for that. Like I could have like a really punchy, vibrant graphic design red, but then I could also have all these different almost muddy hues, which work really well with the farming
Yeah.
topics at hand. Um, so yeah, I got pretty obsessive about all the different color manipulation. It probably takes longer to do a two color book than say a full color book.
I could see
Like
that. Yeah.
that limitation, like it makes you work harder, like push that limitation to its limits.
Did you know you wanted to do that at the outset? Did you make a decision, or did it sort of find you as you were starting to work on it? Like, I'd like to add some
Well,
color.
it was first proposed by Uncivilized Books by Tom Kaczynski at Uncivilized. He's like, "Oh, we could do a spot color if you want one." And of course, red was the first thing to pop into mind. But at first, I was experimenting with doing like a watercolor of the book, and I found like that was getting a little too muddy, and I didn't know how to maybe print it in the way that I was happy with. And then I was looking at Chinese woodblock printing, and they usually use like a red or orange tone, and that's really what ended up inspiring me the most. So they would use like a black, a gray, and a red or an orangish red hue, and it was perfect color palette for this project. Probably a book that's has a similar palette is T. Bowie's The Best We Could Do, um, which was an inspiration for this book. And she ended up blurbing for Ginseng Roots, but she also uses that warm orangish red, and it's beautiful.
Yeah. It's almost like using a little bit of grayscale, but not in gray. A
Yeah,
little so you use it, in when you're trying to sort of wash out some of the in between spaces and things like that. Sunsets, I noticed, or sunrises,
yeah.
worked
Autumn
really well.
leaves because
Yeah,
ginseng is harvested in autumn, so it's associated with all the maple trees turning bright red in Wisconsin. Um, yeah, and for me, it was again like serialization. It was a chance to try something new, and it was sort of a compromise between black and white, which is generally my preference, and color, which has become the new standard, even in indie comics. In the 80s and 90s, like color was not a financial option, so there was a limitation imposed on you that forced the aesthetics. But it's still the aesthetics I prefer, black and white. To me, there's
yeah.
a real like purity to that format. It's like there's it's just not as fussy. It's like you feel the handwriting of the author when the color isn't adding the extra distraction. So doing a single extra color felt like the compromise between these two competing formats.
I think it works exceedingly well. So,
Oh, thank you,
kudos.
Michael. Cool.
Some story questions. I noticed, at least in the early chapters, because I read the version as a book, um, and you get back to it a couple times that you are bringing in, well, I don't know if this is the right word. Like there, in terms of how you are portraying your family, it seems as if, and you mention it in the book, there's a little bit of a corrective from blankets, right? You introduce, she's always been there, of course, but not in the books, your sister. You notice that, the image that you're portraying of your parents seems softened. Um, was that something sort of conscious that you wanted to do with this book, or did it just kind of manifest out of the story you were telling and more of a nostalgic look back on, your
Yeah,
childhood or life?
both, I think, because this book is documentary in general. Like all of the dialogue in the word balloons has been recorded and transcribed. I'm not making up the dialogue, and that obviously applies to all the interview subject and farmers and growers, but also with my family. So whereas with blankets, it was a reimagined memoir where like the dialogue was just pieced together from my memory along with some poetic license. This I didn't have that indulgence. Like all the dialogue was directly from people's mouths and then also screened or approved with them. I'd show them the pages before they went to press. And um, and also, yes, from the very first conversations I had with my family, like when this was just the first seed of an idea for a book, there was a lot of discrepancy in our memories. Like out of a family of five people, we all remember things different. So then there was the challenge of like, well, then what do I do? Which one, who has the truth? But I just solved it by exposing everybody's voice and showing that there's an inconsistency. That's the nature of memory. And it's a kind of a thread that is carried through the whole book. Um, does that answer? Yeah. And then also, yeah, as far as like, I started blankets when I was 23 years old. And the graphic novel was not really a thing yet. It was not a book I thought anyone would see. It was a book I created while we're in conversation with my brother and sister, but not with my parents. It was something I did in secret from my parents. And I feared if I exposed the book to them that it would just shut down the whole process. Um, and when that book was published, it wasn't well received by my parents. There was like 5 very awkward years of dealing with the fallout of that project. So I didn't want to repeat that, but also I was in a very different place. Now I'm the age my parents were when Blankets was published. And my parents are, getting old and more vulnerable, and they're the ones that need caretaking. So that switches the dynamic a lot too. But yeah, I guess I felt like Blankets, it certainly captured the way I felt sort of controlled by the authoritarian and fundamentalist aspects of my parents. But it didn't capture the lighter sides of them, the fun and caring sides of them. So this I think is a more nuanced view of them. It's a more mature work.
Makes sense. Uh, you mentioned at the outset sort of balancing this look back at your family and life and on the ginseng picking with a deeper dive into the history of ginseng and ginseng farming. Did you know you were going to go as deep as you did into the ginseng research? Because it's pretty deep and pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, I think I did. I mean, again, I felt intimidated. I didn't know how I would pull it off. But from the very beginning of my research and realizing that ginseng was like at the core of the trade relationship between China and the US before we were even a country, I think at that point I realized I'd stumbled on something. Um, and probably the most intimidating part of the book is where I had to write more about the scientific side of things and the sort of like all this research and synthesizing the sort of compounds of ginseng to use for pharmaceuticals. Like that was all above my pay grade. Uh, but because I don't have that real scientific mind, I was able to just sort of translate what was coming at me from the scientist into a more layman's view and a visual view of these things. But yeah, ginseng, so as I mentioned a moment ago, I was like, it's as far as we know, it's been indigenous to the Americas, before certainly before Europeans came here. And the very first Jesuit explorers in the 1700s, 1708, 1718, they started exporting ginseng to China at that time. And then when we became our own nation with the ratification of the Treaty of Paris in 1784, to help pay our debts to France, we had our first boat, America did, to China, and it was loaded primarily with ginseng. And that's what paid the debts to start our country. So I think just even with that little nugget, I was like, oh, this, ginseng is a bit of a white whale. Like there's a lot to explore here. And I like books. I just name dropped Moby Dick a little, but I like books that indulge in these sort of detours, labyrinthian detours, um, to expand on a subject and then work their way back to the main narrative.
I do like that as well. I feel like again, I hadn't read issue by issue, but reading sort of chapter by chapter, where things go and what aspect of ginseng is going to be explored here and there. And I think you sort of dip out and dip in, or weave it through, whatever, metaphor you want to use, in a really interesting way. It doesn't, I feel like it doesn't get too much. Like I'm like, oh wait, I want to get back to the, you know, family aspect or the narrative. Um, the when I'm sort of you're in ginseng mode, I'm like very interested. And it helps. You go back to your sort of cute, not animal in this case, but sort of cute mascot, I guess, phase, with the ginseng root person. Does he or she have a name?
Yeah, I guess if we're going to gender the ginseng root, there is both a he or and she in
Sure.
there because, at least in terms of the book, American ginseng is feminine and the Asian ginseng is masculine. That's sort of how they're looked at energetically, a yin and yang. They
Yeah.
are actually different species with different properties that sort of balance each other. So the American ginseng generally has a little red ribbon to denote her femininity. Uh, but in ginseng, in like Chinese myth, there's all these stories of ginseng roots coming alive. They're anthropomorphized, like the mandrake root in say like Harry Potter or Pan's Labyrinth. It's a little
Right.
root that comes alive and can run through the forest and evades hunters. And I read like dozens, if not hundreds, of these little stories. And of course, I can't help but have these cartoony visuals in my mind. Also, when I went to China and Korea, all this branding for ginseng has these cute little ginseng mascots, and I wanted the opportunity to create my own in my own
Yeah.
style. Although there is probably a style that's a bit influenced by Dr. Seuss's The Lorax, because I'd say that was a inspiration for its environmental themes. Uh, but yeah, it was, as you're mentioning, like it was just a way to balance things out, to use all the like tools of like the comics language. If the book started to get too heavy-handed and informational, I would move towards my personal family, vulnerable, emotional story. And if it started to get too emo, and navel gazy, then I would turn towards back to the research or turn towards this little mythological ginseng root, who I like to call Shangy.
Shang. That's
Yeah,
right.
because
Yes, you did.
Shang is what the
Yeah.
locals in Wisconsin call ginseng. So Shangy.
It might be. I wonder, having not read the letters columns, were there people sort of like me that were kind of ignorant of the history and, I guess, size of ginseng agriculture within the United States? I had always just sort of taken it for granted that this is a Chinese thing. That there wasn't ginseng was not American in any way.
Yeah, you're normal. Most people come from if people even know what ginseng is, that's rare enough. But also, yes, most people do not know that it grew domestically. And it's not exclusive to Wisconsin. I mean, it's the whole Northeast region of the, United States. New York used to be a huge growing region, all throughout Appalachia. That's where you find a lot of the wild ginseng and those sort of like, what do they call them? Appalachian outlaw types foraging through, looking for wild ginseng. And now the biggest region in North America for growing ginseng is Ontario. It's like that's the corporate mega growing region, and promptly displaced Wisconsin in the 90s. But when I was a kid, so it was the entire identity of my town. Like it was what we were known for. I learned recently that our town was thought of as kind of like rich snobs by other local small towns that we'd play sporting events against, because so many of the people were ginseng farmers in my town, and that was a far more lucrative crop than say corn or soybeans or dairy.
Right.
I had no idea, but that might contribute to the fact that I felt even more poor and working class in my town, because the other working class people were actually making pretty good money on their ginseng farms. But yeah, it was the identity of our town, but also I never thought of it as being special. It's just like, oh, this is what we grow. It doesn't mean it. I feel like that's another thing I'm trying to correct with this project. As a kid, It was just a job so I could buy comic books. And I think for a lot of the farmers, ginseng was just a lucrative crop and it made more money for them than corn and soybeans. And they didn't care about where it was getting shipped to or who consumed it. They just knew they could make a little more money doing this than other crops. And so this was like a chance in my life to actually be curious about it. And it's a endlessly fascinating herb, you know. But yeah, it's not something that the average reader had any knowledge or, let's say, interest in before the book. Hopefully, I make it interesting to them.
Yeah, you sure did to me.
Okay.
But I certainly, even just the revelation that this was a huge crop and sort of the cultivation, and all the, it seems like a kind of a finicky,
Oh, very much so.
crop, I guess, in terms of how you have to grow it and the time that it takes and the shade that you have to put over. Uh, it's it's incredibly interesting, and it makes me think that unless you're going to make some money on it, why would you ever kind of, you know, do this? Because just set up rows and rows of corn like everybody else.
Yeah,
Just
you're exactly right. It's a high risk crop,
yeah.
but if it pays off big because it's worth 10 times more than other crops. Um, most crops don't do well in high density cultivation. And the problem with ginseng is, at first people were growing it in very small patches, like a family garden, and then they got bigger and bigger. And the bigger those gardens became, the more disease and other problems they were going to have. Um, Things like corn, I mean, as we know, corn and wheat and soybeans, all these crops in the US are just laden with pesticides, chemicals, pesticides, fungicides, and all kinds of chemicals. Ginseng is too, not on the scale as those other things, as potatoes or something. But can you hear the dog right now, or is it okay?
No, you're
Okay,
okay.
great. But yeah, very sensitive crop and also takes at least 3 years, ideally 4 or even better, 5 years to get a full root. And things can go terribly wrong in the last year. You can have a great crop for 3 years and then suddenly in the fourth year, disease hits and you lose everything. So it's very high risk. I think there's a lot of correlation to like the artistic life. One, there's definitely a labor of love aspect, but you can work on a book for 4 years or 10 years and maybe it doesn't land, it doesn't sell, it's pretty high risk in the same way. And there's definitely like you could be a jobber and have a little more stable, you know, income, but maybe not the adventure of working on a crop like that.
So I wanted to ask two questions to sort of sum up or to sort of end. One is, well, one each for the two threads that are within this book. One is, has your family read the book and what kind of feedback have they given you? And then I'll ask my other one.
Yeah, definitely they've read the book. As I was saying earlier, like with each issue, I would record, I'd work on the issue, but then before it went to press, I'd show what I was working on to the interview subjects. And there was pushback from my parents, never from my siblings. My siblings, my brother and sister loved the book. But my parents had some pushback. And that started with after the second issue came out. They would have preferred that the book just focused on farming and not on our family. But that didn't feel like an option. Especially with the last issue, last chapter, it felt necessary now that I kind of expanded to explore the whole world to kind of come back to this microcosm and this very emotional root of my family. So the last chapter and the last issue was very nerve-wracking for me. Like, what are my parents going to think of this? How is this going to go down? I was really nervous to show that one to them. And there was a little bit of pushback, but ultimately my mom, and I depict it in the issue, just said, it's your book, and you can do what you want, like they gave their blessing. And but when I started this project, I thought I was going to focus on my relationship with my brother because that's who I remember being in the fields with for all of my summers of my youth. I had forgotten entirely that my sister worked in ginseng because she only did it for like 1 or 2 summers and she hated it. So she got out and she did babysitting for all of her childhood for income. And but in fact, My sister has the best memories and recollection of anyone in my family. And once I started talking with her, it activated way more information than I would have had in my recall. And then we became way closer. Like over the course of this project, like my sister's like one of my best friends. And that's a result of, I don't know, the intimacy that this project nurtured. And I think her having a chance to have her voice, it amended that problem with blankets where she's totally
Right.
invisible. But even just, yeah, just to have some part of her voice depicted on paper, I'll have to ask her, but I think it was nourishing for her.
Yeah. Oh, that's great to hear. I was especially, I think, curious about your brother actually, because towards the latter chapters when you guys are traveling, he does a couple of pages or half pages, and has thought bubbles, and there seems to be whether it's out wasn't it didn't seem like it was out in the open, but some sort of mental conflicts.
Yeah, I think I can talk about it without spoilers. That my brother and I traveled in South Korea and Northeast China for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and about halfway through the trip, he'd had his fill. I mean, literally, he'd seen enough ginseng. He's like, okay, enough with the
I get it.
ginseng. Like, I'm in China. What am I doing? There's all kinds of other interesting things to do. But also, there was all the roadblocks of just navigating these, especially once we got to China and we wanted to go to the Northeast Jilin province region, which is hard to get to. It's not a
Yeah.
place that Western tourists go to. There's no direct flights or anything. It's just a bunch of hassle. We're right on the border of North Korea. We had to hire a translator. I think it just at a certain point, like, this is exhausting and it's not fun. And I have a limited vacation time. I'm taking a break from work. I think I'd rather just go do some tourist things in China. And so there was a moment where we were, going to break apart there before we came back together and
Right.
and that was a big turning point. So yeah, that's depicted in the book. In the series, my brother does a page or two of his own comics at the end of every issue. And once we hit issue 4, by about then, my brother felt like he'd drawn all the comics he had to draw about ginseng. Because in my head, I thought like, oh, he's gonna draw half of this book.
Yeah.
But he drew like maybe a dozen. He's like, okay, that's all I have to say. And for me, it took 400 pages to say what I wanted to say. So, um, but in the book, there's these cool sequences where we're both drawing on the same pages, and you can see our styles overlapping, and that was probably my favorite thing, and a chance to tap what I'm most nostalgic about in drawing in comics is like when I was a little kid and my brother and I would sit and draw on the same piece of paper together, side by side. I
Yeah.
mean, that's what I'm always trying to recapture in life, I think, is that feeling.
Should do some jam pieces with
Yeah.
other cartoonists. I
Yeah, that was a
know
big
those are the
thing in the
most difficult
90s.
to coordinate. Yeah, yeah.
And they're also unpublishable. I mean, they're fun to do, but then you're like, oh, like either they're filthy or they're like just don't make any sense, and so
yeah,
it's like you can't
yeah.
share them with the world. What's a good example of I mean, I guess
I
mainstream
feel
comics,
like
there's,
there was. I feel like there were a couple of Eric Larson things where he would draw the dragon, and it's I. Do you know these? You
yeah,
know this
yeah, I've seen
character,
some of
right?
those. Yeah.
I think he did it with Don Simpson and
Oh,
Megaton Man,
okay,
and
that
I
makes
think
sense. I think I've seen that one.
they both were doing their character, and I don't know if it was a full book, but anyway, that's the only one that comes to mind. But yeah,
Okay.
it seems pretty difficult to try to
Yeah,
coordinate like where the figures are going to be and how much space you have to play with. But
yeah,
anyway, I don't know, maybe something to explore.
yeah. I'd love to.
All right, so my other question for the other thread of the book is, and I guess it's sort of metaphorical, is what is your current relationship with ginseng? Like, do you never want to sort of see it again? Do you still, after having gone through this project, have even more questions? Would love to continue your explorations?
I love ginseng. So about a year ago, when I was still living in one stable location, I was in Portland, Oregon. And this Chinese medicine practitioner I was working with actually ended up prescribing me a couple different formulas with ginseng. So that was part of my daily ritual. is taking my ginseng. And I love the flavor. I can't attest to seeing any big changes in my life, but I also was only on that regimen for a couple of months before I was thrown out into chaos of travel. And I wasn't going to bring my glass bottles of ginseng, formulas with me while traveling the world. But I love the flavor. I love the actual object. I love the root. It's very beautiful. Before I started this project, I would have said I had no culture of my own. Like I just grew up in this generic small town in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin. That was like sort of place that country music songs are made out of, like gravel roads and pickup trucks and American football. Uh, but then after this book, I've really come to have a sense of identity around that place because of it was so unique in the case of its agriculture and ginseng and how fascinating ginseng is. So it's actually given me something akin to hometown pride, which I've never had before in my life. As I say that out loud, I'm almost embarrassed because I don't really believe in those kind of things, team spirit and patriotism and whatnot. But yeah, it gave me more of a sense of cultural identity related to a very specific place in the universe.
That's fantastic. A good place. I think a good place to end it. But for those of the folks out there, two questions. One, what is on tap for the immediate future? Do you have any things percolating? And then
Oh, that question.
yeah, yeah.
Well, what's on
You
tap is my 2-month book tour, which is about to launch. So, Ginseng Roots, the book, comes out April 29th. And that starts with an event at NYU's Poetry Project in New York. So, from April 29th, I actually started a couple days earlier in LA, but then for the next 2 months, I'm going to be on the road in the US, and it's like 20 cities. It's just like jumping around and it's just surviving those things. So like doesn't give me a lot of opportunity yet to start or dream of new projects. I think I already did almost 4 months of touring in Europe.
oh,
I'm setting out on these 2 months in the US. I'm hoping that by July, I'll have cleared my plate, that I can start thinking about where I might settle down. And I think it might take until then before I can start dreaming of the next project. Because that's maybe one last detail I would add is that, like, during almost the entire course of this book, I haven't had a stable home or environment. I've moved 12 different times during the course of those 12 issues, mostly between Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon, and Minneapolis. Um, but eventually I want to find a place to stabilize again. So I was all along this book project searching for a sense of home and belonging, but I'm still looking for it. And maybe I'll find it by the time book tour wraps.
and we're back. Um, really enjoyed talking to Craig. You probably know from his work, if you've read any of it, that you kind of already know Craig. He puts a lot of himself into his books, especially Blankets and this current one, Ginseng Roots. And it's just great to talk to the person behind the pencil and pen, as it were. And I really encourage you to go out, get Roots, and also check out Craig on tour. I'm gonna try to give it a shot. See if as he swings through the Northeast, if I can get to one of his book signings. But I think he's doing an entire book tour all over the country. So go out there, meet Craig, get your book signed, and take advantage. So that'll do it for this episode of Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you, Craig. Thank you all out there for viewing, for listening, for rating, reviewing, subscribing, helping to get the word out about Dollar Bin Bandits. And we'll see you next issue.